There's so much pent-up frustration and so little ability to communicate one-on-one with others. But yeah, you put those two things together and you've got a powder keg waiting to explode.
November 11th, I'm here with Dr. Timothy Drake at Chicora. We just recorded an orchestra last night. What did you think about that? Did you enjoy it?
I thought it was fantastic. I tried not to interrupt, so I stayed in the periphery, but it just sounded wonderful. And I think it's great because that's really the first music that this house has had at that level, to my knowledge, since the war. The families who live here are very musical and performed a lot. There were stories where Mrs. Anderson performed for Confederate soldiers when they were on furlough. She ran a girls' school here, and they had a harp, a harpsichord, a piano, and other instruments, and they would perform for the soldiers. So it's interesting that y'all came and did the production here, Confederate's Last Farewell, because it sort of, to me, represented what was done in this house during the actual war.
That musical talent kind of came in handy when Sherman's troops came in, right?
It did. During Brown's Raid of 1865, Mrs. Anderson was here with the girls. In this room where we are now, this was the dining room. The raid occurred in Anderson on May the 2nd, 1st and 2nd of 65, and they were about ready to eat dinner. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which is when most Southerners ate dinner. And the slaves alerted her that there were a large group of soldiers riding down the lane to the house. And at that time, the lane was about 3/4 of a mile long, and this was all surrounded by cotton fields, so they could see the soldiers from a distance. And she came back into the house and told everybody to remain calm. The soldiers did surround the house. They started burning some of the outbuildings. They butchered the family milk cow. They shot the mule. They'd gone down and set fire to the grist mill and the sawmill along the creek. But she was a very strong lady, and she said, actually one of the captains and a subordinate officer led the horse into the back hallway of the house. And they dismounted, and she said, would you mind letting us have our last meal here, because this is probably the last food we'll see for a long time. And of course they were terrified. Even though it was the end of the war, they'd heard the horrendous things that had gone on as Sherman's army had moved through Columbia and all. So the captain and his subordinate officer reluctantly sat at the table with him and ate. And during that whole meal, the soldiers were ransacking the house. They were breaking open chests and stealing things. They took the family silver, even off the table, stuffed it in their pockets. After the dinner, she calmly asked the captain to go across the hall into the music room, and she had 3 of the girls play the piano, the harp, and the harpsichord for them, and entertained them. Gave them some of her husband's pipe tobacco to smoke. He'd been killed 3 years earlier in the war. And so, you know, they enjoyed the music and enjoyed her hospitality so much that after that they had the dining room table taken and put in the front yard, and they had each soldier file by, and there were close to 100 men, one by one, and empty out their pockets and their knapsacks on the table and return all the valuables that were taken. Even though they burned the outbuildings, they left her with all of her valuable possessions that were in the house. So music did play a part in that.
And you say this place is kind of haunted, right?
I've had paranormal investigators here twice now, and they've identified numerous spirits on both occasions.
You think they could feel the music last night?
I think so, especially because this morning when you all came just a few minutes ago, the television upstairs was turned on by itself. So things like that.
It's pretty weird. Like I mean, it was, when you said, like, do you hear voices, like something in my heart was like, whoa.
Yeah, and it was completely, it did it while we were down here. So
I wonder if sometimes they can just feel like our intent or something, because I just know, like, certain songs that I'll play, I can feel the presence sometimes. You know, if it's like Confederate's Last Farewell.
And I'm sure that, you know, Bailey Brazil, who was she married Bailey Brazil after the war, and he was sort of her savior. He was her husband's best friend, and it was kind of that quintessential Victorian love story. He came back and looked after her, ended up marrying her, bought the plantation back for her because she had lost the plantation, like most Southerners has lost land after the war. And he lived and died. He died here in the house, I think, in 1918. And the paranormal folks said that his spirit is in the dining room.
Really?
They saw him, a man with a long gray beard. And so I'm sure if he was here last night, he had a tremendous time listening to the music.
I'm just wondering, like, you know, with everything that happened to the South, do you think, do they cry for any kind of justice? I mean, or do you think it's like just something that's just been buried? It just seems like it's such a tragic sort of end to a civilization.
Well, I think Southerners up through my grandmother's generation were very, very tied to the events that occurred, especially after the war in this area, because this area of South Carolina didn't experience as many hardships during the war. There were a lot of refugees who came here from the coast who experienced loss there from Sherman's March, but Reconstruction was the hardest here on folks. And so my grandmother's generation carried tremendous grudges against people from the North. It didn't matter if their ancestors had only come here in 1900, way after the war. If they were Northern, they were automatically blamed for the things that went on.
Yeah.
And she wouldn't even let a Northerner through her front door. They came through the side door that the maid came through. Things like that.
It was very real, right? Those feelings.
It was very real to her. And I heard stories growing up as if they had happened yesterday of the Yankee raids in South Carolina and the depredations that were carried out among the people, the Southern people, to try to demoralize them. And I mean, some horrendous things. I mean, to the point of in February when Sherman's troops marched through, they not only burned the houses, but they took the winter coats and the clothes from the people and threw them in the fire when the house was burning. So they left these women and children with no clothes, no coats, no way to keep warm, no way to survive. They took all the food. And so they basically were trying to not only destroy property, but kill the people too, through freezing them and disease. And so that really caused a lot of problems afterward with hatred toward the federal government.
And that's why it was so intense.
Right.
I'm going to grab this guitar. I want to... Tell me if you know this song. It kind of deals with that. It's called Good Old Rebel, do you know? I am a good old rebel, and that's just what I am. And for this land of freedom, I do not give a damn. I'm glad I fought against her, I only wish we'd won. And I ain't asked no pardon for anything I've done. I hates the Yankee nation and everything they do. I hates the Declaration of Independence too. I hates the glorious banner that's dripping with our blood. I hate that striped banner, I fitted all I could. I rode with Robert E. Lee for 10 years, near about. I got wounded in 3 places and I starved at Point Lookout. I caught the rheumatism while camping in the snow. But I killed a chance the Yankees and I'd love to kill some more. $300,000 Yankees lie stiff in southern dust. They got 300,000 before they conquered us. They died of southern fever and southern steel and shot. I wish there was 3 million instead of what we got. I can't take up my musket and fight 'em now no more. But I ain't gonna love 'em now, that is certain sure. And I don't want no pardon for what I is and am. I won't be reconstructed and I do not care a damn. I I am a good old rebel, and that's just what I am. And for this Yankee nation, I do not give a damn. I'm glad I fought against her, I only wish we'd won. And I ain't asked no pardon for anything I've done. And I ain't asked no pardon for anything I've done.
That pretty much sums it up.
Yeah, I just felt...
Reconstruction was hell on earth for the people in this part of South Carolina.
Well, it's just like I felt like we were just gonna have a conversation, but something in the back of my mind was like, you need to play that, like, yeah, because it just still it's still there.
Yep. Yeah, it was basically an extension of the war and the privations that people had suffered for another 10 years until 1876, and had you been a loyal Confederate, and most of these Confederates were not men who owned slaves, or a lot of them never would have been able to own slaves because they were not economically advantaged enough. And they were boys who were fighting because they felt their homeland was being invaded by a foreign force. The same thing as if we were marched on by Mexico or Canada. They fought for what they believed and died for what they believed, and they looked at the federal government as enabling that invasive force to come into their homeland and take what they had worked generations to achieve.
Isn't part of the bitterness because they were Americans? It's because
they were Americans.
Isn't it a feeling of betrayal? Or?
The oldest Americans were in the South. I mean, by the 1860s, many of your families that had started in the North had migrated south. So by that time, most of the inhabitants of South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Florida, they were descended from the families who'd settled Virginia and the Carolinas and Massachusetts and those other places in the early 1600s, early 1700s. And so they were old Americans. They had 100+ years of American experience.
Yeah, I mean, these were the people who really got going.
Their ancestors had signed the Declaration of Independence. They had been influential in the Revolutionary War to win the freedom of this country. And so they were looking at this as an invasion of foreigners. Immigration was a tremendous issue then because we had so many people coming across from Germany and Italy and Ireland and Scotland and other places. And a lot of these boys who were coming across were very poor. They were fleeing famine and fleeing poverty. And they were met on the docks by the recruiters for the U.S. Army and the U.S. military, and they were paid a bounty to join those military forces. There were so many languages spoken in some of the Union companies that they couldn't even communicate with one another. And so sure, these people looked at this as an invasive force of foreigners who was being coordinated by the federal government to come into their homeland and take what they had.
But isn't this something we're kind of like dealing with again? Is immigration like a hot button?
Immigration has been an issue from the very first days this country ever was conceived.
But it seems like right now it's huge. Why do you think right now it's shaken up?
It's as huge now as it was in the 1850s before the war between the states. A different group of people, but it is as huge as it was then of a political issue.
Are there things that are similar to now, like right before the war happened?
In my opinion, we are as divided politically now as we were in the 1850s over similar and different issues. We have a lot of different issues that weren't issues then, but I think this country is as polarized now as the North and the South were polarized right before the war broke out.
What are the biggest differences?
The biggest differences are we are polarized along a lot of racial lines now. That's different from the war because most of your polarization, the people who could vote in those days were white men. And so you had a very great division among white men as to what they believed should be the path for the country. Now you have included minorities, women, all these different groups, so those types of issues come in as well. And so I think we're polarized on social issues now more so than political issues that would have been the polarizing factors then. A lot of economic issues then, westward expansion. The issue of slavery was an issue, and that kind of tied in with states' rights and westward expansion as well, because the ability to take your property into new areas where you might go to break new ground and progress in your agricultural endeavors. Now it's more importation, exportation of goods. I mean, it's still economic, but there are a lot of social issues that revolve around racial tension now. I think, and tension even between women and men, as we've seen with the Me Too movement and all this, that are motivating politicians to take one side or the other. And there's not a whole lot of middle ground being sought by either end. And the same thing happened during the war. They weren't seeking middle ground. They were one pole or the other.
Right.
So different issues.
So what's the similarity then? I would say, like what is is there a big similarity?
The similarity is just a divisiveness that has been placed into a society that should be a unified society, that should be coming together and working things out. And this is even, people say that media driving issues is a new thing. It's not. If you read the newspapers, and that was their major form of communication back then, were newspapers. Leading up to the war, there was a very divisive nature of a lot of the news reports then too. So, you see that then in writing and now more in media like television and radio, trying to sort of egg on both sides against one another. And I think that's sad.
But you're saying it's not a new phenomenon.
It's not a new phenomenon at all. I mean, that went all the way back into when people have first been able to communicate by writing, even in Europe.
I can tell you, from being around the media and some pretty close-up things, I mean, they're not exactly the most virtuous people, I mean.
Well, and the reality is controversy sells.
Well, yeah.
If you have a controversial topic, you take one side or the other, you promote your perspective, and you're going to sell newspaper or news time or whatever.
It's just kind of the way things work.
It's the way things work. And so, you have to read both sides and then come to a decision on what's right and what's wrong in both perspectives.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. Now, your family's been here for, what you say, how long?
Part of my family's been in South Carolina since 1670. Mother's family's been in the United States since 1608 in Virginia. And then I had ancestors on the Mayflower. But my South Carolina roots go back to 1670, to the first population of the colony here.
Oh, wow. So when you're talking about original Americana, that's like...
And most people in this area, if they did genealogy, they could probably trace ancestry back hundreds of years in the United States, as most Southerners who have lived here their whole lives could do.
So, because one thing, I guess your family line, we could, settlers, right? I mean,
they were colonizers. They were the initial settlers of America.
That's one thing, in talking to people about this, people always say, when they're talking about America, they always get on Americans well, why are you against immigration? Y'all were immigrants. Mm-hmm. Well, there's a little bit difference between colonizing and immigration.
Big difference. Your early European ancestors who came here, and African ancestors, for those who are descended from the early African slaves, and white indentured servants, I might add. Right. I had ancestors who came over as white slaves to Virginia. But they came to a wilderness, and from that wilderness they built a society and a government. They fought, their descendants fought for the freedom of this country from England. They were invested with blood in what we have today. And so those of us who are descended from those people are not against immigration, but we want to see some logical safeguards put into place for immigration in this day as were in the past. Things like health, for health reasons. I mean, you look at Ellis Island. None of my ancestors came through Ellis Island. They were always already here when that was set up. But they had pest houses. They would quarantine people for a number of weeks just to make sure they weren't bringing diseases into this country that we weren't exposed to. And if you look back across American history, most of what has changed the population of this country, initially the Spanish and English and French bringing diseases to the natives, were disease. It wiped out entire populations. Smallpox came in and just decimated the native population. So we've got to safeguard, and now as well as back then, against diseases that could be brought in.
Yeah, but what about, also you got to think, what about diseases of the mind? I mean, socialism.
Socialism is very, in my opinion, is very dangerous because this nation was conceived as a democratic republic based on the principles of capitalism. I mean, those who work and those who save and those who strive to succeed will, and those who don't shouldn't. And the whole socialist belief is that you tax and you penalize those who strive and those who earn and those who save, and you give it to those who don't. And we're headed down a dangerous path, in my opinion, because we're at the tipping point in this country where we have as many people not working as we have working. And a lot of those people who don't work by choice, because we're in a third or fourth generation social support system right now, where the government, through welfare, EBT, whatever, is supporting a large group of people. We can't continue as a nation doing that. We cannot have fewer and fewer people working to support more and more. And that is socialism. And socialism eventually will cave in upon itself.
It's not sustainable.
It's not sustainable at all.
And that's the thing. I feel like there's so many people, especially my age and younger, that they have ideas and they base them on like what they think is moral, but it doesn't actually. It's not realistic.
No.
It's not has nothing to do with how the world works.
And then, we are in a different age. Most of what we became or were formed as a country to be was based on an agrarian society.
And I wanted to ask you about that because I've read. Have you ever read "I'll Take My Stand"? It's like 9 essays.
I haven't.
And it's from the Southern point of view, from the Southern agrarian point of view. And they do speak a lot about the differences between agrarianism and industrial capitalism.
Right.
So, which was interesting to me because when I think of the South, I think of supporters of capitalism generally. But these guys were making a distinction. Is there a distinction between agrarianism and the philosophy in agrarianism and industrialism?
Industrialism has always been based on the exploitation of others for profit. Agrarianism, even during the time of slavery, you all shared in the same system of profit and loss. If a plantation or a large farm who had either hired workers or slaves succeeded, everybody on the plantation or the farm ate well. If you failed through lack of work or lack of saving for the next year or whatever, weather failures of crops, you all suffered, you starved. In the industrial world, you had these tremendous fortunes being built, especially during the robber baron era, by people like Carnegie and Vanderbilt and Rockefeller and these others, based on the absolute depredation of other people. And Carnegie actually felt guilty for it later in life and gave a lot of money to libraries and organizations. But if you were a factory worker in the North, you had just come across as a poor boy from, say, Ireland, you got a job in a factory and you were very expendable. If you could not work for 2 or 3 days, you were thrown in the street to starve. If something happened to you, you were not looked after. In the agrarian South, if you were a slave, you were a tremendous investment. You were a planter could buy 100 acres of land for what he spent for a slave. And so when that slave became ill, when that slave could not produce, that slave was usually taken care of by the master's wife or someone on the plantation until they were well enough to work again. If the master's family didn't eat well, the slave families didn't eat well. If the master's family ate well, the slave families ate relatively well. They ate pretty much the same food. So in an agrarian system, even though you had a social division, you pretty much all depended on each other every day. It was a codependency.
But doesn't that sound like socialism?
No.
Just when you say it that way?
Well, true democracy and true socialism are the same thing. But
this was not democracy.
No, this was not democracy.
And it wasn't socialism.
No.
So what makes it different, like this sort of agrarian thing? How does it take a sharp turn away from socialism? Because when I hear you say it's everybody connected and depending on everybody else, that doesn't sound capitalistic to me.
Well, but there was a tremendous profit factor in there because the planter had to be able to compete in the market and to profit in order to sustain the plantation and sustain his way of life. And so, yes, the slaves did benefit, not as much as the master did financially. So there was always a division of wealth, of course, the master receiving almost all of it upon the work of the slaves. But the slaves did benefit from hard work. It's not like they sat around and did nothing all day and still benefited. And in a modern day interpretation of socialism, it is the government supporting people who don't work to earn
Whereas
their
this
own
is
keep.
familial. Is
Yeah,
is that kind of what I'm hearing?
Right,
like,
right.
There was families.
Families, yeah.
Right, and they were kind of their own businesses too.
Each plantation was almost a country unto itself. The larger plantations, everything you made or used in the way of food, clothing, whatever, early on, especially in the 1700s, was made on that plantation. They were self-sufficient pretty much. And then what they didn't have, they would trade the goods they produced to get. We really have no communities or families even who are self-sufficient now. We can't even compare what we are now to what our ancestors who ran these plantations were, because we don't even grow gardens, we don't grow our own food, we don't produce our own clothing, we don't. An agrarian society had to do all that, whereas your industrial societies, both in the South and the North, those big industrial towns, they relied on the outside world for everything they wore and ate, and they didn't really produce a whole lot. So you did have that, the producers versus the consumers. And the industrial societies produced goods and products, but those usually were for export or for use other places.
So you're saying the agrarian is more like a self-sustaining?
Self-sustaining, and when you work every day, side by side, in the upcountry of South Carolina, you had a few large slaveholders, but most of the slaveholders here were families who also had a lot of children, and they had maybe 10 or 12 slaves, and they worked in the fields beside them every day. And you developed close relationships with those people. It wasn't at all what popular society is trying to tell people now, all this revisionist history that's out there, and saying that the slaves were beaten and abused every day. What's
the
so
biggest
far from
error
the truth.
when you say revisionist history? What's like the biggest misnomer you see, like when you're looking at from your eyes?
The biggest misconception is to believe the fallacy that these people were not close to each other or they didn't care about one another. They cared about each other in most cases as much as you would if you ran a small business and cared about your employees. It was a very close-knit society on these smaller plantations where everyone relied on each other. Slaves were not only an investment, but over time, these were multi-generational groups of people. They lived together and worked together for generation after generation after generation, 4, 5, 6 generations sometimes. And so the white people and the black people who lived on these plantations together, quite often their grandparents and great-grandparents had lived and worked together. And so you do develop a lot of mutual regard. There definitely was a social stratification. Everyone had their place, and they were expected to stay in that place, just like ancient Greek or Roman society, because the Southern society was pretty much at least conceived and thought about that they were recreating the society of ancient Greece and Rome. So there was a stratification, almost a caste system within society, but if you operated within the caste you were expected to operate in, there were no problems usually. And that was even between a planter and his wife.
Was that disheartening for people who wanted to, if they were bright and they wanted to move forward? Because we always think in America, it's like, if you work hard at something, you can get ahead. Was that dispiriting for people to not be able to do that?
It probably was at times, but it's not like they didn't have opportunity. I mean, if you had been a female in the 19th century on back, yes, you were extremely limited, whether you were a black female or a white female. The black females were even more limited. But white females from upper-class families still were very limited.
They had limitations.
They had extreme limitations because of societal expectations of what was proper and what wasn't. If you wanted to move outside of your caste and outside of your class, you could do things. But if you wanted to maintain caste in a southern plantation society, there were only certain ways you behaved. A lady maintained herself in a certain manner and behaved in a certain way, and a gentleman did the same. If you did anything outside of those social expectations, then you would lose caste, and you were an outcast, basically. And that happened a lot. So if you'd been even a female writer, often would publish under a pseudonym because it was not proper for a lady to produce anything in her own name and remain that level of society. Victorian rules were very strict.
Was it like that in the North too, or mostly?
Yeah, it was like that in the North in the upper class families.
Okay.
Same way.
So this
Same
was
way.
a kind of a national
It
thing.
was a national thing. It was all based on English tradition, French tradition of what the upper classes should do to remain in that level of society.
Do you think it's ironic that we're talking about Yankees and all this, and yet when I was in New York, and I went, this was not very long ago, a few months ago actually, and I went to Trump Tower for the first time. The only people in Trump Tower were Southerners. Mm-hmm. Is that ironic to you that you have Southern support for this? I mean, he's the Yankee of all.
Sort of is, but even during those days, it was much more of a mobile society than we think it was.
Really? See that?
And you had tremendous associations between families in the North and the South, but old families.
Okay.
Your old wealthy Northern families and your old wealthy Southern families were tied by tradition and blood, mm-hmm. and association. A lot of Southerners in Charleston, planters had houses in Newport, Rhode Island. They would go away for the summer. People would go to Philadelphia and get a wife and bring her back, to marry from a good family. So you had a lot of ties between these families of the North and the South. And when the war broke out, a lot of these upper-class Northern families were in support of secession. They did not speak out against it. I mean, you had some strong ties. The banking industries were so tied together in New Orleans, New York City, and Charleston that it caused some real problems for the federal banking system when New Orleans and Charleston seceded and became a part of the Confederate States. To the point that New York City bankers even talked about perhaps seceding as well, because the southern states control most of the national capital because of the agrarian profits that had been made in the 1850s in cotton.
So was the South, it was more profitable than the North, is what you're saying?
Oh yes, the seven southern states that initially seceded contributed over 80% of the gross national product of the United States at that time. That's why Lincoln didn't want to lose the states. That's why he wanted to maintain the federal union.
But then how could have the North been so much more industrially advanced?
They were industrial. The Southern people's wealth was based on agricultural commodities. Cotton was bringing such tremendous prices. Sugar was bringing tremendous prices. And so the crops being produced in the South were bringing in tremendous amounts of European money because most of those were export crops.
Right.
A lot of the Northern industrial products were being used within this country to build up railroads, infrastructure in the western and northern cities. So the steel and things were being exported, but not to the extent of Southern cotton.
Is that the South not diversifying? Is that kind of what did them in with the war?
Pretty much. I mean, the Southern states did not have the Confederacy did not have munitions factories at the level of the North. They didn't have, the DuPont powder factory was phenomenal for the North. I mean, we didn't have anything comparable to that. We didn't have many cannon factories. So yeah, military munitions, the lack thereof really was what lost the war for the South. It wasn't morale. It wasn't.
I've seen the morale was high.
The morale was tremendously high. I mean, it's amazing when you look at what some of those Confederate companies did. Even in advanced states of starvation and having no clothes. I mean, a lot of them were marching like in the Revolutionary War with rags wrapped around their feet. They were so desperate for shoes when they had a battle, they would go off and go out and pull the boots off the dead soldiers who had died and wear those. There just really were no industrial manufacturing mills or munitions factories or even food, way to get food to the troops in the Southern armies. So that's what lost the war, really.
Why, when you say their morale was so high, and like what was driving them? What was was it just a patriotism or like?
Absolute patriotism and the desire to keep out the foreign invasive force. Most of the war was fought in the South. It was an invasive force in the South. So the perception until the end of the war, and as much as we hate General Sherman, my family has always hated Sherman because of what he did. Sherman was a brilliant military tactician. He saved hundreds of thousands of lives because what he did was when he marched through the South, he attacked the Southerners where they felt most he attacked their heart when he started burning their homes and putting their wives and children out in the cold. That is what demoralized the troops. That is what made them say, let's quit fighting in Virginia, go back home, we've got to get home and look after our wives and families. Interestingly, when that happened, until the masters and the ones that had slaves could get back, the slaves were the ones who maintained those plantations. They brought in the cotton crops. They looked after the women and children who were in their care. I've always said if those slaves were being so horribly abused, why would they have hung around, even after the war, and looked after the white families? Because they were a codependent society. They depended on one another. There was some mutual affection in a lot of cases on these plantations. But yeah, Sherman's March is really what ended the war and sealed the deal for the Confederacy, because the boys and men wanted to do nothing more than just leave the army and come home to look after their families.
That was that.
Yep, that was that. So Sherman, as much as he's hated, as much as I despise him as a person, he was a brilliant military tactician in his march through South Carolina and Georgia and North Carolina.
And Lincoln was hated too, right, by the South?
Lincoln was hated. I think the reality, though, would be that if Lincoln had lived, we would never have experienced Reconstruction in the South, because Lincoln was one who wanted the war, when it was over, to be over. He wanted the countries to be reunited and for everybody to get along as they had before, and even better. Lincoln actually had a plan to early on to remunerate all the planters for slaves that were freed. And after the war, he wanted to take those slaves and send them to Liberia, because he saw some of the racial issues that would arise between the races when slaves had equal status to their masters politically.
So he wanted to send them to Liberia, which is the...
He wanted to create a separate country for them. Yeah.
Well, that is a separate country, right?
Yeah.
Liberia.
Yeah. And ironically, if you look at the history of slavery in the world, I believe Liberia was, if not the last, one of the very last countries to officially outlaw slavery. It wasn't outlawed officially till the 1950s. Because when the slaves, the expatriated slaves, went to Liberia, one of the first things they did was get slaves, because it was a reality of agriculture in those days. You know, if you did not have a slavery system in an agrarian economy, you could not become rich, because the mechanization, they didn't have farm machinery, everything had to be done by hand. And so without a large labor force, you couldn't produce a crop that would make you wealthy. So, and you see that even in the South. Quite often when slaves bought their freedom, and they did that quite often, or were given their freedom, if they wanted to become a prosperous farmer, a lot of those slaves actually purchased, or ex-slaves, those freedmen purchased slaves of their own. And we had some fairly large slaveholding blacks in South Carolina. Mr. Ellison down in Sumter District was one of the largest slaveholders in the state, and he was a black man. And he was one of the most brutal slaveholders in the state to his slaves, and that's historical fact. So it wasn't just a white-black system, it was a necessity of an agronomic system if you were going to survive in that era.
Right, yeah.
So
it's hard for people to picture it, I feel like, because there's so much, I don't know, just people don't, I guess if you've never been there, it's like hard to really grasp it.
The Southern society, the Southern agrarian slaveholding and non-slaveholding society was such an intricate, convoluted, confusing society that there's no way we can grasp a true understanding of that without deep study of firsthand accounts that were taken and written during that time period. You can see it on the surface, it looks one way, but if you really delve into that Southern society, that social stratification, those familial relationships, those relationships between slave and master, there's no way to come to a good understanding without going and reading all the primary sources of information, and diaries, newspapers' accounts of the day. A good source of that is the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s, where they were actually doing slave interviews.
I found that was very interesting, because
I've read all of them, all 1,100, and
it's very nuanced once you start reading that, because it blows away caricatures, and that's something that I feel like I feel like that's a problem nowadays of just having such a superficial knowledge of something.
Yep.
That, I mean, some things, if you just have a superficial knowledge, you don't really get it. Like,
you can't take one narrative on either side of the spectrum and extrapolate that across an entire society and relationships.
That's interesting because, when you say the narrative, like that's a big thing. Like, in American society, but, before the war, was the narrative as consolidated as it is now? Or maybe that's just a technology. Because I feel like that's what's happening nowadays is like the narrative is being questioned. That's why shit's getting kind of intense, right? Because people are like, well, I don't know if I believe the narrative. All these things, we're at an impasse, and you were saying like the tensions are high. You think they're like more racial? The
racial tension is higher now than it has ever been during my lifetime. And I grew up during the civil rights Southern years. I remember the day Martin Luther King Jr. was shot. I remember, we had people who helped us at our place. I had a black mammy, and I remember the day he was shot, and I remember her crying and say, "Why can't people just get along?" And there was no hatred. The people who worked for us and around us and with us who happened to be black, there were close relationships. My father's best friend growing up was a black boy. My best friend growing up was my black mammy. She was everything until I started school, pretty much next to my mother and grandmother. There were strong relationships of love. And I think one of the problems we have now is we have a whole group of white people and a whole group of black people who don't have close social interactions with one another of any form. And I think not working together has created a division now that didn't exist in those days. Of course, then there was this, nobody was equal. There was not an equality. You still had that social stratification. But because you have social stratification doesn't mean you have hatred for another group of people. You have love and regard for people no matter what level of that social structure they're in. And I think that's where we've got now. We have a lot of hatred and dislike for people if they're not in our same social stratification, our social structure, or within our small group of friends or people. It's
a lot of hatred.
A lot of hatred. And
you see it online.
And I just, maybe it's because I was young, but I've asked my mother, I said, why were people so separated when you were little? She grew up in the 1930s. She said they weren't separated. She said everybody had sort of their place, but we all cared about one another. And she said it was economic based just like it is now. But she said we had no hatred for someone because they were black. She said we had as much respect for a black woman as we did a white woman, or a black man as we did a white man. The governmental restrictions in the South were pretty severe after Jim Crow laws went into place. Riding on the back of the bus, separate bathrooms, separate water fountains. But the people who operated within that system never really questioned it until the 1950s and 60s. Neither the whites nor the blacks really questioned it. It was just how things always had been. And not that it was fair, but those issues that are causing such violent divisiveness now didn't cause that violent divisiveness back there. The people who actually experienced those prejudices did not have the hate, I think, that some of the modern generations have.
Yeah, and that's the confusing part, because it's like, where is the hate coming from? And here's another thing that I think about. A lot of the hate, is frankly between whites against white people. Like it's just based on like differences of opinion. And why is that happening? Because I feel like the most vitriolic hate is just white people against white people.
All this political divisiveness. Yeah, and it's
about opinions.
It's about opinions. Yep, it's about opinions.
So, but what is the underlying thing? Is what I'm trying to figure out.
I don't know. I think if we could figure it out,
I guess we would.
We could run for public office and rule the country. Yeah, but I really think it gets down to that. We really are in a me society now. I've seen this more now than ever before. I'm 55 and I've lived through, not as much as somebody much older, but I'm old enough to have a little bit of wisdom. And I see people walking around now so self-involved, so self-absorbed, so self-aware, which is the new term.
Woke.
Woke.
Yeah.
Everyone's woke.
Yeah, that it's really scary because they they have, I think, false compassion in a lot of cases.
I hate that.
They have false compassion.
And I really, truly hate that.
My grandfather in the Great Depression had real compassion. There were families that were starving. There were families here during the Great Depression, white and black families, who had nothing to eat. We've never experienced privation like that. And I think that type of privation brings people together. We're so entitled and so well-fed and so materialistic that we can be self-absorbed. But during the Great Depression, my grandfather would walk to work every day. And there was a family on his way to work that he noticed. He got up really early so he could save his gas ration money. And he had to walk a few miles. And there was a family that were so poor, the children were actually out grazing grass in the morning to fill their bellies up. They were eating grass out of the yard and weeds. And so my grandfather had a big garden. And so he got to where every week he would take a sack of produce by early in the morning because they were too proud to accept help. And that was the difference then and now. People then were too proud to accept any handout. They would starve first. They would not steal. They would not do what people do now. And he would take them food, and later in life, one of the children or something had seen grandfather do that, and they told him later in life that if it had not been for his benevolence and taking those vegetables by every week, that family would have starved. Now, how many people do you think would do that now?
Not enough, probably.
It's just, and those people were, and the black people who lived around my grandparents, both sets of grandparents, loved them dearly. They were very close-knit. They worked on the farms together. My grandfather grew up plowing a field not far from here from sunup to sundown. And his father was a wealthy farmer. They farmed 800 acres of cotton. But he worked side by side with the black tenant farmers. And he got up and he plowed barefoot all day long from sunup to sundown behind a mule. And so did the black people, So it was one of those things where you worked together, you sweated together. There was a divisiveness of social structure, but there was not a divisiveness of love and regard for one another. And I think that's where we are at fault now. We don't have that close love and regard for one another as people because we don't have to. We can stay compartmentalized in our own little worlds and develop our own opinions about what we hear. Technology has been one of the greatest downfalls of our social structure in this country. It's given us a lot of ease. It's given us a lot of good things, but I think our social structure is hundreds of years behind where my grandparents were in 1920.
Yeah, we're in a kind of a free fall, aren't we, at this point?
Yeah, and we have right now at this point going on 2 generations who have come up with extreme contact with the computer world and not a whole lot of interaction with other people.
Oh yeah, I go out all the time and you talk to people and you want to be friendly or whatever, and you're talking to somebody like you would in a natural situation, and they look at you like unable to offer anything.
And every human being has the same needs and wants. It doesn't matter what race you are, what class you are, how wealthy or poor you are. Everybody desires to be loved and respected. And it's gotten to where we don't give each other that anymore. We don't give each other the love and respect that every human being needs to have. So, and my mother always said, no matter how deplorable somebody is, you can find something in that person to love. So, if we all looked at people that way, it would be a much better society. And all this racial tension, all of this cultural tension would just go away. But we're human beings. We've been the same way since the beginning of time, and there will be always things that cause us to.
And there's almost like a desire to fight, isn't there?
It seems like it sometimes. There's so much pent-up frustration and so little ability to communicate one-on-one with others. Yeah, you put those two things together and you've got a powder keg waiting to explode.
But there's something that you said that really caught me. You said that people had too much pride to accept.
Oh, they would starve to death before they accept a handout.
And that pride was something that they took very seriously, right?
Exactly, and even if you look at what Roosevelt put in place during the CCC, the Works Progress Association, they didn't just give people money. They gave them the opportunity to earn money. And that does two things. It gives you financial success if you save and earn. and it gives you satisfaction that you're accomplishing something, and it builds up your self-respect. And if you don't have self-respect, you really don't have anything. And a job was one thing that they saw could give these people self-respect, because they wanted to work. They didn't want to be at the mercy of other people. And I think that's one of the dangers of getting back to the socialist movement today. The desire to work is just not there in many cases.
And the pride's not there.
And it's not the immigrants who are coming in. It's our own citizenry. I mean, it's, a lot of these immigrants who are coming in are willing to work hard to make a better way for their family, as our ancestors were. But we have such an entitled group of Americans. All of us are entitled, all of us, because we have so many conveniences. We have food at our fingertips. We just go to the grocery store or go to fast food and buy whatever we want. We don't have to bring our food out of the ground. We don't have to work hard for things. And so that expectation of getting things without having to work hard for them is there. We are really, every generation that grows up in this country, every successive generation is more and more and more spoiled, and it's going to be our undoing. It really will be.
And it's kind of like inevitable. There's like really nothing that can be done about it.
And you look at farmers who have family farms that have been in the families for 200 years, and so many are being sold now because the ease that's sought by the current generation is not going to be found in farming. It is not an easy life. It's a satisfying life. It's a very gratifying life, but it's not easy.
You think there would ever be a situation in America where agrarianism would come back?
I think we passed that. We would have to have a cataclysmic end of society as we know it, and a tremendous die-off of our population. And those who would survive would probably start out in an agrarian society because they have to raise and grow what they ate. It would take something like that, massive food shortages. We have seen some bit of a return to people wanting to grow things with this organic movement, but none of us could grow enough food to survive through the winter on. And I have dealt with a lot of homeland security and biosecurity issues, and we have about a 4-day supply of food in every grocery store. If we had a disruption of food channels for 4 days, people would start to go hungry because people don't keep provisions.
It's so quick that it can
change.
Quick.
It could change in a heartbeat.
And that's something that I was talking with, my family about, because I always notice whenever there's like a storm, and people go to the grocery store, notice how the shelves start to clear out pretty quick. And I was like thinking, man, this wouldn't be good if there's like...
No, if we had a disruption in the food supply for a week, we would have people who would be almost ready to go to war to get food. And the thing that frightens me is our governmental policies and some of the environmental policies are making it harder and harder for farmers to farm and produce crops unless you're a huge corporate farm. And so a lot of agriculture is moving out of the United States. With every farm that goes under and is developed under subdivisions and houses, we lose that agricultural land. So we're becoming more and more at the mercy of other countries for our food. And that's a dangerous place to be.
Hardly the land of the free at that point, right?
That's a dangerous place to be. When the Union troops came through during Sherman's March, one of the first things they did was they destroyed the food provisions that had been put away, because every family on these plantations, they were self-sufficient. They stored the food for them and their slaves for the coming year. So, a lot of the march was during the fall and winter. And the first thing they did was they depleted the food supplies. They would steal what they could steal, they would burn what they couldn't take, they would kill what they couldn't take, and they would salt the garden plots. They would take the salt out of the smokehouses and they would put it in the vegetable gardens so that people could not grow food there. So the disruption of the food supply and the starvation of the population was a primary goal. And so even then, food was the most important thing. And they sought to disrupt that. And it wouldn't take a marching army to disrupt our food supply. It would take one incident of something like mad cow disease or foot and mouth disease or avian influenza or some sort of invasive pest that might be brought into here that could wipe out the U.S. food supply in short order. So,
do you see mass immigration as an invasion, or do you look at it differently?
No, I don't really see it as an invasion. I see it as something we need to be concerned about because of the issues of disease and the overburdening of our social welfare system.
Yeah.
I think logical immigration is a good thing. immigration done, we always need to bring in people with new ideas and new perspectives. And I don't look at it as an invasion. I think that if it's done with some degree of care and planning, which is what the current administration, in my opinion, is trying to do, they're enforcing the laws we have on the books, we're okay. But if you just if you fling the borders wide open and let everybody rush in, we're going to be so overwhelmed we won't be able to support anybody. We'll have a health care crisis, we'll have a food crisis, we'll have, you name it.
I'm asking a lot of questions. Is there anything you want to talk about?
How did you get into the music field?
I just love music, you know, so I was like, well, I started writing songs that led to guitar, so.
Are your parents talented musically?
So I don't really know exactly where it came from. Apparently I have a great-grandmother that went to Juilliard.
Oh, okay.
So
That's
it must
great.
be in the blood.
It's in the blood.
Somewhere, yeah.
Yeah. Those talents usually run in, well, you know, a lot of our, and I was discussing this with a friend last night, we've sort of moved away from this belief or this fact that a lot of what we are is genetic. It's ingrained in us genetically. There is some social conditioning, there is some nurture, but most of what we are, they're discovering, and there's some studies that have come out lately, is nature. A lot of what we are is passed down through our genetic lines, and you can look through genetic lines of families and you can see the same talents or the same negative things passing generation after generation after generation. And you know, when you look back at our ancestors, my ancestors were very selective in who they married, what families they married into. They did what I call selective breeding. And that was very important to maintain those certain talents and characteristics in families. And I think musical talent is one of those, because you look through families and you see a tremendous amount of just innate talent in art and music in certain families. And here we're going back to the old beliefs of society, and I know in certain levels of society you only married certain people. You married for advantage, you married people who were like-minded, who were from the same culture, because that perpetuated those positive genes. In a lot of cases, not so much health-wise in some cases, but at least in the desire to succeed and work ethic and you know, I think current society has taught us no, anybody can be great. No, greatness ran in families, and you can achieve some degree of success. But if you look back through families of old that had true greatness, that greatness was generation after generation after generation. And I think we're losing some of that in our American society because we are so prone to put it scientifically, breed with anyone. It's not selective breeding anymore.
Which is kind of a recipe for mediocrity.
And people, exactly, and people look at that as being very elitist and very wrong for this democracy that we're in, but it was what governed our existence for thousands of years. And so only in the last 2 or 3 generations or so in America have we conceived of not marrying or uniting ourselves with certain people from other families to create children who are also successful and who will have the talents that are passed to them through genetics.